Here we go again for the second episode of the Sanibel Chronicles. I want to welcome you to the channel, and I hope that you have had time to check out the first one, and also hopefully you'll find this second installment interesting. I have a little housekeeping to do on last week's video. I made an incorrect statement when I was talking about the Bailey tract on the refuge on Sanibel being acquired. It was purchased from the Frank Bailey family, and I misused the word inaccurate, and it should have been accurate. So just to correct the situation. I also have to correct something else, I'm told. One of our subscribers has told me that I misused another word, and that word was hot water heater. My granddaughter advises me I should have used the term water heater. So I'm going to get even with her for correcting her grandfather. I'm going to show you a tape or a video, I'm going to insert it here, of her taken about 3 years ago. I had given a program on one of my new books at a library down in Naples, and I borrowed a large indigo snake from Chris Lekowitz at the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, just to have something alive to exhibit it. I should point out the snake is legal. It's under permit from the state and the federal government, and it's used in the Conservation Foundation's educational programs. So that is Amber. She's a good kid, and I hope she enjoyed seeing herself on international television.
Even youth gets tired.
I know. Oh, thank you, Leslie.
Oh, he's almost white underneath. Well, I got a lot of pictures. I'm going to go home and send them to you. I got a good one of the three of you.
Do you want to get in the picture?
The last video was seen actually far and wide. In the United States, I now have some subscribers from California across the country to Maine. And lo and behold, I got a very nice message of congratulations from an old friend who lives in Japan. So this YouTube is quite unique in that it reaches many people with a great variety of interests. Last week was entirely off the top of my head. This week I've gone ahead and I've prepared a few notes to keep myself on track. I want to also talk about the Jean's former home on Marco. She told me that the damage to the building was because of a hurricane, the 1944 hurricane, and I'm showing a track of that storm just as a little bit of historical context as it came out of the Caribbean and increased into a major hurricane that did a great deal of damage to Marco Island and also Sanibel Island. And a woman by the name of Beth in Maine raised a question on water. What kind of water did we drink in those early days? And within my time range also. The houses on Marco where water was provided by rainfall that fell on the roofs and into cisterns. That, in Jean's case, that was the sole source of water for the first 13 years of her life. So it was a very, very important commodity to have a cistern. On Sanibel, when I first moved there, I also drank cistern water, but also water from a shallow well. And a little later on in this presentation, I'll insert a clip from a beach walk program that I did 39 years ago at the Sanibel Lighthouse. It talks about the water, it talks about the conditions at the lighthouse, and it also covers a little bit of fortune telling on my part, because I describe what would happen to those old buildings if a major tidal surge impacted the eastern end of Sanibel. So I think you'll find that interesting. If I don't get enough detail on the water and our sources of water, then please comment, ask a question, and I'll cover that in more detail later. We were fortunate in 1965, a group of island businessmen grouped together and formed the Island Water Association. And in 1966, we living at the lighthouse connected to that water system. So all of our trials and tribulations with water ended. I'd like to tell you one story. After Hurricane Donna in September 1960, we had a shallow well, with a jet pump, not far from the living quarters. And the storm surge from Hurricane Donna stayed put long enough for that foul water to impact the surface water aquifer we were pumping from, and that water was pretty much ruined. We then used a well that you'll see during the film clip at the lighthouse point. We ran a pipe from a faucet on that well into an old tank between the two quarters that was a cistern that replaced a wooden cistern that was taken out in 1944 by that hurricane that I showed the track of. And we would pump that water into the houses for the toilets, for the sinks. But for drinking water, we still had one cistern at the lighthouse at quarters 1. You've probably seen the base where that cistern once sat. And I'll be showing an image a little later of the cistern that was connected to my old place before I arrived there, that provided water to that building. But in about 61, I ran a pipe from that Coast Guard well, 62, because the well wasn't put in by the Coast Guard until 62. I ran a flexible 1-inch pipe, buried it between that well and that old rusty tank, and it ran continuously, and it kept that tank as full as it could be because of the leaks, and that was where we got that non-potable water. For a time, I carried 5-gallon carboys of water from a spigot in the kitchen of quarters 1 down the stairs and up the stairs of my house, where we had a water cooler, a rented water cooler, and we used that to drink the water. And then finally, we ran another pipe from quarters 1 through the kitchen wall of quarters 2, and we used that water. Somewhere, probably 1964, I was home for lunch, and I went to get a glass of water from the spigot, and I picked it up, and it happened to catch the light through the window, and I could see all of these little crystals floating in the water. So that startled me, so I took that glass of water next door to the manager's house, Tommy Wood. He looked at it, and he couldn't figure out what it was. He said, "I think we better quit drinking this water." And what it was, the roofs of the lighthouse quarters back in those days were made from asbestos shingles. And those crystalline material I observed in that clear glass of water were particles of asbestos. Now, so far that hasn't killed me, but my doctor told me that I was probably fireproof. The cistern is pictured in one of the still photos with my family, and you'll notice that my family grew from 1958 until 1960, when our son Chuck joined us at the lighthouse. He was born in Naples like his sister was. Our daughter Leslie lives in Fort Myers, and our son Chuck has lived on Pine Island for many years now. When I was talking about the cisterns on Marco Island, I failed to comment that I'm adding another photograph somewhere in this vicinity of the small settlement on Marco Island that was known as Caxambas. Jean's house was in a tiny village on the northern end of Marco Island, and that's where the most of the boat traffic came, and that's where the Marco Island Church was located when she was a child. At the southern end of Marco was another community called Caxambas. And Caxambas was there because it was a site of one of the major clam factories that was located on Marco in the early part of the 20th century. Baron Collier, who owned most of Marco Island, and who Collier County was named after his passing. After he died, his children decided to develop the Caxambas area. So they went about 7 miles further to the northeast, where there was a mangrove peninsula with a large Indian mound on it, and they leveled the Indian mound as they did in those days. And they moved all of those homes that you see in the photograph, all of the buildings, including the post office, the Caxambas post office. They moved those to Goodland and gave them free and clear to the people that lived in them on Caxambas. However, they then charged them a purchase price for the property where their homes had been relocated to. So that's quite a bit interesting aspect of Marco. I recall a few years ago, Jean and I went down to Marco to a pioneer celebration. Her family, the Williamses, are one of the pioneers of Marco. And she went into the visitor center on Marco and asked them the easiest way to get to Caxambas, because Caxambas, or all of Marco, had been completely changed since she was a child, and the people in the visitor center didn't know where Caxambas was. And Caxambas was a unique place. When I was a kid, when I used to go down to Marco, even during the days that Jean and I dated, there were still large sand hills on the south end of Marco, rolling hills, and they were just very, very unusual. And there still are remnants of those hills on the south end of Marco. I'll be talking more about Marco, the historical aspects of it, later in future episodes, so I don't want to get too far into that subject now. When I spoke about the early housing in Marco and how primitive it was not only on Marco Island. I believe I mentioned that people on the out islands lived in quite unique housing. And I had to throw in this photograph. This was taken in 1947 on Captiva Island. This is a photograph of Joe Whiteman and the dwelling he lived in, a palm-thatched hut. Joe is a character on Captiva. He was the electrician for both Sanibel and Captiva. I knew him well. He often came to the lighthouse to do work for us because the wiring in those buildings was quite backwards. And there's a street on Captiva now named after Joe Whiteman. So if you get to Captiva, check out, I believe it's called Whiteman Lane. I believe at this point I'll go ahead and insert the videos. As I said in the beginning, the beach walks that I did them in 1980s to the mid-90s until 1992, was to raise funds for my sea turtle project that worked along the lower Florida Gulf Coast. In future episodes, we'll cover details and adventures about sea turtle conservation. And these were done, as I said, to raise funds. They were very well received. I had groups, as many as 40 on Saturday mornings during the season. Very enjoyable for me because it gave me an opportunity, as this blog does, to speak about things that were really important to me and part of the things that I enjoyed during my life on the islands. So we'll pick it up after the video, and please, if anything in it is unclear to you, then please comment, and it will certainly help these episodes grow and be more meaningful.
A well casing that goes down 585 feet into a layer of water that's called the Lower Hawthorne Aquifer. And here on the Island Water Association drives in wells to that strata of water, or maybe even 200 feet more. They then pump it through a subterranean pipeline to the reverse osmosis plant up on Sanibel Captiva Road. And there the water is electronically charged and forced through specialized membranes, and all of the solids are then taken out. Solids including, of course, the chlorides, the salts. When this well was put in, it came in at 3,000 parts per million chlorides. Seawater in the Gulf is 35,000 parts. So this water would have a very distinctive salty flavor. It also has the odor and the taste of rotten eggs because of the sulfurous dioxide gas that's down inside the earth. This is an artesian well. The head pressure when this was put in was 20 feet. That means there was a 20-foot jet of water coming out of the ground before it was capped. This particular well was put in by the Coast Guard back in 1962. Incidentally, this land we're on is still owned in fee title by the U.S. Coast Guard. Had the technology been available to the Coast Guard back in '62 at an economical way to desalinize this water, all of this land at the Lighthouse Point would have been gobbled up and turned into a Coast Guard reservation. We would now not have the liberty to walk through it and enjoy it. But because the Coast Guard didn't have the technology to do it economically, they changed their mind and eventually built their big Coast Guard facility over at Fort Myers Beach and not on Sanibel. So that well is responsible for saving this point. With that well over there, when I first moved to Sanibel, my family and I, consisting of my wife and my 2-month-old daughter, moved into that house, the second house, because back in those days, this was the headquarters for the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, and we lived there until July of 1979. And back in those days, the early days, the only water that we had literally fell out of the heavens. It fell on the roofs. We had gutters and downspouts, and on top of this red brick structure was a 10,000-gallon cypress cistern. And then over between the houses was a 20,000-gallon metal tank. You can see part of the old footers over there where the tank rested. And then in front of that, between the houses, there were 2 tanks, or 2 towers, that went up almost as high as the main chimneys. And on each of those was a 2,000-gallon metal tank. At the base of one of the towers, we had a well point that went down in the ground. A well point is a perforated pipe through which you can suck water. And it went down about 5 or 6 feet into about that same type of water where the little footbridge was. Just a brackish water, subsurface water. And we had gauges on the tanks. Whenever we needed water, I would turn on pumps that were located on the porch of quarters 1, this house. and I would pump water from the well point up to one tank and from the metal cistern to the other tank. Well, the brackish water from the high tank then fed the toilets of both houses. To flush the commode, you use the brackish water. The other tank fed the showers, the kitchen sink, the lavatory. But for drinking purposes, we drank the water from this tank because it was much easier to clean it just before the rainy season started. Or once the rainy season started. Once the daily rain started to come, we knew that this was a routine. We could go ahead and drain the cistern, clean it, and then regain our water very quickly. This was something usually done about the 4th of July. To get drinking water, we had a pipe that went through the wall of this house. This is the kitchen here, this wing. The houses were actually flip-flopped when they were built. They're flip-flopped 180 degrees. But my quarters had been remodeled, and the kitchen is located where that window is to the left of that stepladder. The original cistern had been located in that house, had been taken out many years before by a hurricane. So that was how we got our water until about 1965, I think it was, we connected to the Island Water Association. Okay, the houses and the lighthouse were commissioned in August of 1884. That means this August they'll be 103 years old. The lighthouse is a landfall light. It's not a light that warned people about rocks or reefs, anything like that offshore. The landfall light has a particular character of illumination, and the character of the Sanibel light still is 10 and 3. That means there would be a blink, 10 seconds of darkness, another blink, 3 seconds, blink, 10, blink, 3, blink, all through the night. So that a person that was navigating offshore, either in a steam vessel or a sailing vessel, if it was dark, he would see this light on the horizon, immediately go to his chart, time the character, say, well, it's a 10 and 3, then he'd know he was off the Sanibel light, not off the Boca Grande light or some other smaller aid to navigation. The skipper would then pick up some range lights out here at the mouth of San Carlos Bay, this body of water over here, and then he would sail or steam up to Punta Rassa, where the toll plaza is, where the high-rises are. And there, if it was a produce vessel, it would load the citrus and the produce that was raised on Sanibel Captiva. Or it might have been a cattle ship that was brought in here under steam, and cattle that were transported from Kissimmee, Orlando, Arcadia, places in the middle part of the state, that were brought overland by cowboys. They were put in large stock facilities at Punta Rassa. They were loaded on the cattle boats, and then they were shipped down to the Caribbean, Cuba, and the other Caribbean islands. Well, in 1926, that storm that I mentioned that put up a 14.5-foot tide, pardon me, a 12.5-foot tide, came and took out all of the facilities over at Punta Rassa, and they were never rebuilt. At the same time, the farming, of course, went out. That storm was lapping on the main beams of these houses. The waves were lapping just above where the pilings are connected to those main beams. The most recent severe hurricane we've experienced here occurred back in September of 1960. That was Hurricane Donna. Donna sort of skirted the coast. We had wind gusts on Sanibel of over 150 miles an hour, and Donna put up a 9-foot tide. This ground we're standing on is only 6 feet above mean sea level, so there was 3 feet of water running over this point. The flood of record that occurred back in 1873, some 11 years before these houses were built, was recorded at Punta Rassa, and there was a 14-foot 7-inch tide. Had these houses been existing at that time, of course, they probably would have been knocked down by the storm surge. The engineers that designed these homes had a heck of a lot more in the ball than some of our more recent engineers. When Sanibel was beginning to bustle and grow, the county was allowing buildings to go in quite close to the beach, as I mentioned, but they were also permitting really substandard building codes because they were allowing buildings to be built down relatively close to the ground level on floating footers. But when the city adopted the comprehensive land use plan, they also adopted federal flood regulations. And if you want federal flood insurance, you must build now with your first habitable floor 12.5 feet above mean sea level. That's why all of these nice new homes are piling homes. Based on the engineering, of 100, 150 years ago, that when the folks recognized what serious impacts hurricanes can do. Hurricanes come in certain levels of intensity. We have several classes of storms. For example, a 100-year storm, and 100-year storms don't happen every 100 years. You could have 10 in 1 year. It's just the computers have worked out these levels of intensity. But a 100-year storm would put up a 12-foot tide. So the 1926 storm was probably one of those 100-year storms. The worst storm we could ever experience is called a 500-year storm. And a 500-year storm could put up a 20-foot storm tide. So it would be 14 feet of water over where we're standing. And these things can happen. Not to paint a...
You might want to buy a house.
Yeah, well, I'll sell one. Not to paint a serious or a bad picture, but you'll notice these little signs that say evacuation route, little blue signs. They don't take into the fact that Sanibel, of course, has grown considerably since this evacuation plan was first developed. And in our evacuation route, we must use the same roads as the many residents over there at Fort Myers Beach are using. And the Weather Bureau really isn't that accurate. I recall back in 1982, suddenly we had a small tropical storm. The Weather Service hadn't forecasted. It's now called the no-name storm. July of '82, I believe it was, and it put up about a 6-foot tide. And just that quick, they had to close the causeway. You couldn't get on or off the island. So just imagine that their forecasting mechanisms break down, and we get a serious storm, and then really all hell could break loose here. It's really, it could be a bad and sad situation. This land, I mentioned, is still owned by the U.S. Coast Guard, and when the Fish and Wildlife Service left here in '82, the city of Sanibel came into the picture, and they negotiated with the Coast Guard to allow them to administer the Lighthouse Point as part of their park and outdoor recreational facilities. When I lived in that house, during a summer squall, without any exaggeration, the water would run down the walls like a waterfall. They leaked so badly. The roof leaked so badly. I had no air conditioning in that house for the first 10 years, and finally I broke down and I bought a personal window unit. I had to drink rainwater. There was no insulation in the walls or the ceiling. So the first thing the city did, they said, okay, Coast Guard, we'll take over this for you, but you've got to give us some money up front. So the Coast Guard gave the city $60,000, and they put on brand new roofs, they put in central air and heat, they insulated it. Of course, they have city water now to drink, not rainwater. When I moved into that house, I paid $4.50 a pay period, $9 a month. And when I left there, the government had raised my rent to over $300 per month. That's the reason I left. And now the city employees that live here, the city manager's secretary and her husband live in this house. Someone from Public Works lives in that house, and they live there rent-free. All of their utilities, except their long-distance phone calls, are paid for.
There's my tax dollars.
Why do they live there?
They bid on it, and they have to conduct certain maintenance tasks like picking up trash and doing painting and repair on the buildings.
Is the lighthouse still being used?
Yes, the lighthouse is still used. If you come across the bridge and you notice it, it's still in character. The Coast Guard tried to extinguish it maybe 10 years ago, but local people raised so much cane they decided to keep it functional. However, it's not, it really can't be used as an aid to navigation. You can be offshore 5 miles, and there is so much illumination from development at Fort Myers Beach and also at the western end of Sanibel, you can't find it. But it's still operable. It's really a funny thing the way the bureaucracy works, too. If you came across the bridge and you were interested in lighthouses and you saw the lighthouse was out, we'll say, you went to your telephone book and you found U.S. Coast Guard, knowing that the Coast Guard is responsible for these things. You called up the Coast Guard while the folks over at Fort Myers Beach would answer, and you'd say, I'd like to report the Sanibel Lighthouse is out. They say, well, thank you very much. We appreciate you telling us. They would then get on the telephone, and they would telephone St. Petersburg, 95 miles away, and say, hey, guys, the Sanibel Lighthouse is out again. The next morning, they dispatch a couple of young Coast Guardsmen with maybe a couple of 250-watt light bulbs. That's what runs the thing now. Maybe some standby batteries, and they would get the thing operating again. That's because, you see, the Coast Guard station at Fort Myers Beach is search, rescue, anti-drug. It has nothing to do with aids to navigation. They're up in St. Petersburg.
Everybody's a specialist.
True.
What do you mean by floating footing?
Well, you know, just footers with rebar, they're called floating footers. It's one of the terms that are used. They're just, well, a monolithic pour is a floating footer, where it's just on the ground surface. It has no anchorage. And most of these new condos that are being built, the houses don't go down so far, but most of the condos go down to bedrock, which may be 17 to 30 feet deep. They're you know, until the impact is such they've struck bedrock. And I was always told that these pilings went down to bedrock too, but at the time the transfer between...
In the video, I talked about the water towers that were set between the two main buildings, and this is a photograph of them taken in 1947. It's a Coast Guard photograph. I should point out, we'll talk about lighthouses in the future, but up until 1939, lighthouses in the U.S. were operated by the U.S. Lighthouse Service. And then in 1939, President Roosevelt converted the agency that managed lighthouses in the country to the U.S. Coast Guard. So at the time this was taken, it was Coast Guard property. Excuse me. The tower to the left in the photograph was a tower that was connected to a, as I mentioned in the video, to a shallow well system, and there was a pump on the near porch of quarters 1, and I had built a sort of a gauge that told me how much water was in these tanks, and when that registered low enough, I could see it from the ground, I would turn on the pump in quarters 1 and fill that left-hand pump. Now that was brackish water, and the only thing it provided water for were the toilets. The other tank, the one on your right, was used originally for fresh water. It was pumped from the cistern. It was a wooden cypress cistern that was located where that metal tank was when that photograph was taken. And that photograph was taken in about 1965 approximately, the one of the family next to the tank. So we didn't use that right-hand tank. And one day I was up on top, I think it was about the time I was building the indicator for the water capacity, and I looked down inside that right-hand tank, and here was a family of barn owls that were living there. And these young barn owls, just balls of white downy feathers, was really quite a sight. And if someone will remind me down the road, I'll tell you a story about some of those owls. The next photograph is of the house that I lived in, quarters 2. You can see its original cypress cistern. It held about 5,000 gallons of rainwater. Now the way this system worked, as I think I explained in that video, rain would fall on the roofs, and you'll see a downspout that comes down at an angle at the very end of the building, and that leads in to the cistern. The cisterns were cleaned in the spring before rainy season started, and then allowed to keep the cisterns to capacity. Now this photograph is from 1935, and it was a U.S. Lighthouse Service photograph. I'll wind it down now. at this point. And please take a moment and consider liking this video, because likes are tantamount to building a product like I'm trying to do on YouTube. So just like it, and then if you really like it, please subscribe, because I'm trying to gain at least 100 subscribers before the middle of next month at least. It only takes a second, and it'll certainly benefit my efforts, because I don't want to share all this information in vain without knowing that people are gaining something from it, learning something, and realizing how different it was here in Florida so many years ago. It was, and frankly, I miss them. So we'll catch you next time. Thank you very much. This is a PS. I failed to mention that I've added a link for those who are interested in subscribing. Is in the lower right-hand corner of this video. There's a photograph of me, a tiny photograph of me next to an American crocodile skull. You click that, and I believe it opens up, and you'll see a hyperlink, my name, I believe, and you click that, and that will subscribe you. And of course, I appreciate this effort to help me keep this blog going. Again, thank you very much.